The fog in the Hürtgen Forest had a way of swallowing everything, sound, shape, even the sense of time, and on November 18, 1944, at exactly 5:47 in the morning, Staff Sergeant Ray Collier was already on his belly behind a fallen pine, brushing coal condensation off the stock of the M1 rifle he had grown to resent. 29 years old, Oregon logger before the war, for campaigns behind him, 29 patrols, 11 confirmed engagements. Yet none of that mattered here, not in these dark woods where the Germans always saw you first. His squad had lost 6 men in 14 days. Same pattern every time. They entered the trees, took 20 steps, and the forest erupted before they even raised their rifles. Collier felt the familiar pressure behind his eyes, the mix of fatigue, anger, and the fear he refused to admit he still carried. I'm Berg, and this is Firepower World War II. If you want stories the records buried and the men were never credited for, consider subscribing. It's the least we can do to keep their names alive. The smell of wet earth clung to everything. A pine branch dripped onto his wrist as he listened for anything, boot scrape, metal click, whispered German. Nothing. Just the dense hush of the Hürtgen, that suffocating quiet he had learned to hate. Collier eased forward, every muscle calculating the risk. Their mission here wasn't glamorous, it was the kind of work that chewed up platoons and left no headlines behind. Recon in force. 60-yard sweeps. Little advances in thick timber where visibility died at 30 paces and the enemy used that blindness like a scalpel. The men joked that the forest wasn't haunted by ghosts, it just turned them into ghosts fast enough. The 9th Infantry Division had been pushed into this patch of hell between Kleinhaus and Gerstenhof, a grid sector whose map lines lied as surely as they promised structure. Nothing was structure here. Germans dug MG-42s into foxholes so narrow you could walk past them without noticing if your nerves shook your focus. STG-44 squads patrolled trenches of shadow beneath the firs. They could hear Americans coming 80, maybe 100 yards away, while Collier's boys were lucky to detect movement at 40. The math was simple. And fatal. When one side sees 3 seconds earlier, 3 seconds is enough to choose who dies. Collier had become painfully aware of how slow the Garand was when raised in cramped timber. Too long a profile. Too much time to shoulder, find the front sight, adjust. The weapon the army swore was the best all-round rifle in the world felt clumsy in a fight measured in split-second snapshots. And every day the dead proved it wasn't just him. It was structural. It was tactical. The Germans weren't better shots, they were better positioned, better equipped for this kind of brawling war in the trees. And the pattern repeated until it gnawed at his sanity. He replayed the moments he hated most. Private Dale Thompson, Iowa kid, 22, built like he could carry a plow through a storm. Good instincts. Good shot. Didn't matter. He stepped into a narrow spool of visibility, just 10 yards of space, and the MG-42 that none of them had spotted shredded the bark above their heads before one round clipped Thompson behind the ear. He dropped so fast Collier didn't even see him fall, he heard it. A heavy thump, a sound he'd never forget. The Germans didn't fire long. They didn't need to. They slipped back into the dark like they owned it. Then there was Corporal Miguel Reyes, from El Paso, a mechanic who used to hum old ranchera tunes while stripping a bolt carrier. Funny guy, sharp as a tack. He caught the wrong angle of a pre-sighted rifle grenade. They never saw the launch. They only heard the hollow thud, then the explosion that punched the air out of the clearing. Reyes clutched his chest where the shrapnel buried itself deep, and Collier remembered the look in his eyes, shock, not fear, as though he couldn't understand how fast everything had ended. And Harold Green. Brooklyn electrician, smart mouth, chain smile type. His squad always said he was too stubborn to die. But stubborn meant nothing against the forest. An unseen rifleman hammered rounds between two trunks where the light barely filtered through. Green went down with a groan that was cut short by the next burst. The worst part wasn't losing them, it was knowing they hadn't been careless. They'd done everything by the book. It was the book that didn't fit this war. Collier wasn't the kind of man who talked about guilt, but he carried it like another pack on his shoulders. 3 men gone because they never saw the enemy first. 6 in total in just 14 days. How do you outshoot a man who's already aiming? How do you win a duel with someone who always has the bead before you even lift your rifle? Those questions haunted him more than the forest ever could. Doctrine said keep your spacing, stay low, drive the rifle up, identify target, fire. That might work on open ground. But in the Hürtgen, identification took too long, the Garand's iron sights 8 seconds they didn't have, and the long barrel made point shooting awkward. The system built a blind spot, and his men were dying in it. He thought maybe he was missing something, some trick other squads used. But talk around the company said the same thing, they were walking into a knife fight with a rifle meant for open field engagements. A German with an STG could throw fast, heavy bursts before an American even finished raising the Garand. And that was assuming you lived long enough to shoulder it. Every time they advanced into timber thicker than a barn's backbone, the Germans punished them for it. Not because they were unbeatable, but because they were better suited, compact rifles, fast-firing, built for close, nasty work. Collier remembered something odd from Camp Wheeler. An instructor had once joked about a trench sweeper concept, a compact semi-auto firing a round too heavy for polite company. Some Winchester self-loading design in .351 caliber. The Army had dismissed it, claiming it was too deadly at close quarters, too much overpenetration risk, too violent to control. The demonstration had been a footnote, a curiosity. The type of thing officers laughed off because it wasn't regulation. But here, in the shadow death corridors of the Hürtgen, that comment echoed in his mind like a challenge. Too deadly at close quarters? In these woods, that sounded like exactly what they needed. The moment the idea connected came the day he picked up a fallen MP-44 from a German he dropped at nearly point-blank range. The rifle felt balanced, compact enough to maneuver between trees, fast to shoulder. A weapon built for terrain like this. Collier stared at it for a long time. If the enemy had adapted their firepower to the environment, why were the Americans still pretending the forest was open fields? He felt frustration rise inside him, the helpless kind that hardens into resolve. He thought about that Winchester self-loader prototype the Army had shrugged off. He thought about how its heavy .351 round hit like a hammer. Something clicked. A stupid idea, but maybe stupid ideas were all they had left. That night, back in a half-demolished barn they used as temporary shelter, Collier couldn't sleep. The forest's cold draft slid across the broken floorboards. He pulled his kit closer, propped a lantern behind a sandbag, and took out a notebook he barely used. The men snored around him, exhausted, trusting him to keep them alive another day. He flipped to a blank page and began sketching. A shortened forend. A taped handguard. A ghost ring sight cut from scrap metal. A compact stock to drive the rifle up quicker. He imagined the Winchester .351 conversion he'd only seen once, then imagined it trimmed and tuned for the Hürtgen. Fast. Brutal. Simple. Simple in theory. Dangerous in practice. He waited until the snores deepened before he slipped to the corner where he'd hidden the pieces he'd bartered from the armor, a worn Winchester 1907 frame and a handful of spare parts that shouldn't have been available in a frontline barn. He laid them out on a ration crate. Every metallic tap felt too loud in the night. He worked slow, cutting the forend, taping a grip, adjusting sling points, checking the balance. Sweat ran down his temple despite the cold. If a lieutenant walked in right now, he'd be court-martialed before he could blink. But if he did nothing, more men would die by morning. He ran the action. Smooth enough. He tested the weight. Manageable. He stared at what he'd built, a compact, vicious brush gun firing a heavy round that could slam a man down even through winter coats and foliage. For the first time in 2 weeks, he felt something like hope. Not confidence, hope. A small, stubborn spark against the misery around him. He nudged a broken board into place to cover the crate and sat back against the cold stone wall. Sleep didn't come easy, but when it finally did, he dreamed of a forest where Americans saw the enemy first for once. A fantasy maybe, but fantasies were fuel in a place like this, and he would need every ounce of it when the sun rose again. Dawn broke like a bruise across the Hürtgen, a smear of gray that barely pierced the fog, and Collier felt the weight of the modified rifle under his coat as he led his squad toward the ravine east of Kleinhau. The forest was quiet in that ominous way he had learned meant trouble, no distant tracks, no shifting branches, nothing but the damp hush of trees waiting to punish whoever stepped first. His men trudged behind him, boots sinking into the soaked moss, each silent in his own thoughts. They trusted him. That was the burden that kept his back straighter than fatigue allowed. He felt the compact rifle snug against his ribs. The balance was different, quicker, tighter, the kind of feel that made the old Garand seem like a parade piece by comparison. He didn't know if it would work. He only knew the old pattern was killing them, and patterns, when ignored, turned into graves. 20 minutes into the patrol, the fog thickened again, flattening the world into a chalk-colored wall. They reached a bend in the terrain where the ground dipped into a shallow bowl. Collier's boots sank deeper. His stomach tightened. This was exactly the sort of spot the Germans liked, predictable movement, limited angles, terrain that funneled men into one direction. He raised his hand, halting the squad, but the tension had already begun to coil in his chest. A faint click came from somewhere ahead. Not a twig, not an animal. Metal. Meaning one thing. They were about to be ambushed again. Collier didn't wait for the silhouette or the flare of a muzzle. He trusted his gut and the faster rifle in his hands. He snapped the modified Winchester out from under his coat, shouldered it with a speed the Garand could never match, and squeezed twice in the direction of the click. The .351 rounds cracked through the fog, deep and violent, like someone slamming a door in a steel hallway. The shape ahead jerked back, then collapsed, a German point man who never got to fire. Then a burst of MG-42 cut the air from the right, but it was wild, panicked, nowhere near as precise as the ones that had killed Thompson, Reyes, Green. Collier had forced them to flinch first. He ducked behind a rotted trunk, motioning his squad to push left where the cover was thicker. The enemy was scrambling to reset. He caught movement through a sliver between two firs. The heavy barrel of the MG swung clumsily, searching. Collier leaned out, planted his feet, and fired a third round. The recoil hit his shoulder like the kick of a stubborn mule, but the round smashed into the gunner's chest, knocking him backward. Silence followed, a stunned hush that felt alien in the Hürtgen. His squad stared at him with the same mix of awe and confusion. "Sergeant, what the hell are you shooting?" Collier just breathed hard, checking the chamber. It didn't matter what they called it. What mattered was the outcome, a German ambush broken before it began, Americans moving first for the first time in weeks. They advanced cautiously, neutralizing the rest of the position. Two more Germans who had been slinking away were intercepted by PFC O'Hara when Collier pointed them out. "Didn't even see 'em," O'Hara muttered. "How'd you know?" Collier just shrugged. "Different angles." But his hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that his makeshift creation had worked. It felt surreal. The forest felt different too, as if they'd stolen a piece of its control. By nightfall, word had already rippled through the platoon. Men approached him in ones and twos, pretending to ask routine questions just to get a look at the rifle under his arm. They didn't even bother hiding their curiosity. "What is that thing? Is it legal? That recoil looked like it could break a shoulder. How'd you manage it? Can you make another?" Collier didn't know how to answer most of it. He only knew the men were tired of losing friends to an invisible enemy. Hope was contagious in a place where hope had been starved for weeks. He could feel the shift. Before this, they had been a group of soldiers waiting to die. Now, for the first time in memory, they were talking like men who might live. Within 3 days, Collier found himself supervising makeshift workshops in ruined barns and half-collapsed huts. A few men, including Private Bennett and Corporal Hirsch, scrounged through equipment piles to find Winchester parts, spare stocks, and broken sling mounts. They were like scavengers, but with purpose. One man found a cracked ghost ring sight from an old trading rifle, another found a set of screws that fit the rear assembly perfectly. It was as if the forest was finally giving something back. Collier guided the builds as best he could, making sure they didn't do anything too sloppy. He showed them where to shorten the forend, how to tape over the grip for traction in the mist, and how to stabilize the recoil so it didn't rip shoulders apart in winter layers. None of it was elegant. But elegant didn't survive in the Hürtgen. In less than a week, 11 men were carrying some version of Collier's brush gun. The armorer had caught on, but surprisingly, the man didn't shut it down. Maybe he understood. Maybe he was tired of filling casualty tags. Either way, he looked the other way, even offering spare parts with a wink. The effect was immediate. Squads that used to get ambushed on 4 out of 5 patrols were suddenly returning with fewer casualties, and more enemy weapons carried as evidence. Platoon sergeants started tracking the numbers in whispered conversations, reaction time shrinking by seconds, kill ratios climbing, fewer men bleeding out on the forest floor. It wasn't a miracle. It was simple battlefield physics. Whatever allowed an American to see and shoot even a single second earlier changed the entire momentum of the fight. Enemy tactics shifted too. Germans began spreading their positions wider, firing shorter bursts, retreating faster when they sensed Americans weren't hesitating anymore. They weren't used to ambushes failing. They weren't used to losing initiative in terrain that had been tailor-made for them. But Americans adapted just as fast. Collier trained his squad to pair up, one scanning high, the other low, using the compact rifles to bounce from tree to tree. They weren't just reacting, they were dictating engagements. Something unheard of in the Hürtgen. It was around this time that trouble arrived, the kind wearing polished boots and carrying clipboards. 2 officers from battalion command showed up for an inspection after rumors of unauthorized weapon alterations began circulating. Collier felt his stomach pitch as he stood outside a makeshift barracks where the officers had asked him to present the rifle. Every man in his squad lingered nearby, silent, tense. The captain held the modified Winchester like he'd just found a snake. "Sergeant Collier," he said, narrowing his eyes, "what is this abomination?" The air grew heavy. Collier knew that tone. The kind used right before charges were written. "A field modification, sir," he said, keeping his voice even. "To counter ambush patterns in the sector." "Who authorized it?" "No one, sir." The captain looked at him for a long moment. Too long. Then he did something unexpected. He sighed, turned the rifle over once more, and said quietly, "Your platoon's casualty reports dropped by half in the last 9 days." He paused. "I didn't see a damn thing. But keep your boys alive. That's an order." He placed the rifle back in Collier's hands and walked away before anyone could say a word. Later, division-level officers would pretend they discovered the concept themselves, calling it part of a limited field adaptation trial. Collier and his men didn't care. Credits and memos didn't matter. Survival did. By late January, Collier's squad had become something of a rumor among other units, a group that moved through the timber with an unsettling confidence, breaking ambushes instead of feeding them. And every time Collier caught his men glancing at him with that mixture of relief and respect, he felt uncomfortable with the weight of it. He hadn't done anything heroic. He had simply been desperate enough to break the rules. What haunted him now wasn't death, but the knowledge that so many men had died before someone tried something different. As the bitter winter wind crawled through the trees, Collier found himself staring at the modified rifle during a rare lull in the fighting. He traced a thumb along the taped grip, thinking of Thompson, Reyes, Green. They should have had a chance. They might have, if he'd made this sooner. That thought burned worse than the cold, but he didn't flinch from it. Regret had a place here, as long as it fueled something better. The forest didn't care about innovation. It didn't care about lives. But it did respond to force, and now the Americans were finally delivering some of their own. Collier had changed the rhythm of combat in the Hürtgen, one desperate idea at a time. But he also knew the war wasn't done with them yet. And somewhere deeper in the timber, the enemy was already adapting, planning their next attempt to take back the initiative. The question was whether Collier's men would stay one step ahead, or whether the forest would reclaim its advantage as easily as it had taken so many lives before. The thaw came slowly to the Hürtgen, and when it finally did, the forest revealed just how much it had been hiding. Mud replaced snow, the icy stillness broke into dripping branches, and the silence that once felt foreboding became something closer to exhaustion. Collier moved through those woods with a different posture now, the modified rifle slung tight against his chest as he guided his men through yet another sweep along the ridgeline. The Germans were pulling back in places, but sporadic resistance still lingered like stubborn embers refusing to die out. He found himself thinking more often about what came next. Not just the next ridge or the next patrol, but what waited when the war finally ended. The idea felt distant, almost frivolous, like trying to imagine summer while buried in winter. Still, it sneaked into his thoughts, what he would do with his hands once they were no longer holding a weapon, whether the woods back in Oregon would feel quieter or somehow louder than this forest that had consumed months of his life. Occasionally, he caught the other men having similar moments. O'Hara muttering about a girl he hadn't seen in 2 years. Bennett wondering if his dad's hardware store still had the squeaky hinge on the back door. Small things. Human things. Things that felt almost dangerous to remember because remembering meant believing they might get back to them. When the unit was finally rotated out and the fighting in the Hürtgen ebbed into another chapter of the war, the modified rifles went with them, silent, unrecognized participants in a campaign that history would mostly record with cold statistics. Collier turned his in at a collection point where quartermasters barely looked up as they scribbled serial numbers onto damp forms. His rifle didn't even have a proper serial anymore. Too many replaced parts. Too many field fixes. One clerk glanced at it and muttered, another one of those brush guns, as if it were an annoyance rather than a lifeline. By the time Collier boarded the truck that would carry him toward the next phase of the war, he had already accepted that nothing he had done would appear in any official report. Men's lives had been saved, but paperwork would never reflect that. Maybe that was fine. Maybe that was the price of doing something outside the lines. Heroism, he realized, wasn't something the army awarded, it was something men recognized in each other when no one else was looking. When the war ended and he finally returned to Oregon, he stepped back into a world that felt both familiar and foreign. The air smelled of pine, but without the underlying threat. The trees stood tall and peaceful, not hunched and waiting like the ones in the Hürtgen. Collier found work in logging again, his body still strong, his hands still precise. Yet there was a quiet in him now, a kind of weight that never fully lifted. He carried a photo of his squad on his desk, taken months before the worst of the fighting. Sometimes he would catch himself staring at it, tracing faces, remembering voices, replaying the way they laughed even when everything around them burned. He never told people what he had done with that rifle. When asked about the war, he kept it simple. "The woods teach you to see faster," he'd say. "And to move before the other guy does." It was the closest he ever came to revealing the truth. The years moved on. Families grew. Jobs changed. Yet every so often, a letter would arrive from someone he'd served with, or someone who had heard the story secondhand from a man whose life had been saved by a fast-moving American in the thick timber. They never talked about heroism. They talked about surviving, about how small ideas sometimes made all the difference. It wasn't until 1987, long after Collier's kids had families of their own, that a military historian researching non-standard weapons in the European theater stumbled on a half-forgotten reference to .351 brush conversions in a dry maintenance report. Curious, he dug deeper, tracking down veterans, cross-referencing diaries, and visiting battalion archives that smelled of mildew and dust. He found a widow in Ohio whose husband had once mentioned a crazy Oregon kid with a heavy rifle that didn't miss. She cried as she read the researcher's notes, finally understanding why her husband had come home when so many others hadn't. The historian eventually published a small article in an obscure journal. It didn't make headlines. But for the few who read it, the story of those rifles, and the man who trusted his instincts more than regulations, felt like a missing piece of truth finally laid bare. Today, in a quiet corner of a military museum, sits a modified Winchester self-loader with no name on the plaque. It's labeled only as a field adaptation, origin unknown. Visitors walk past it without a second glance. They don't know that it helped rewrite the rhythm of combat in one of the most brutal forests of the war. They don't know how many lives it saved. They don't know who held it. But history, real history, is not written in plaques. It's written in moments of desperation, in choices made by ordinary men who refused to watch friends die. Official records say the rifle was too deadly to deploy. The real legacy is that it saved men who never would have survived without it. Most people never heard the name Ray Collier. Now you have. And remembering him, honoring him, is as close as we can come to keeping the truth alive. If this story resonated with you, consider liking this video so more people can uncover stories that deserve to be remembered. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Firepower World War II and join a community dedicated to preserving the legacies the history books forgot. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, or if someone in your family served. Every voice helps keep these memories alive.